Hey guys, if you like what you see here, be sure to check out my Blair channel. Everything I upload goes up on Blair first. See videos a few days early over there. So my sister got me these blue light filter glasses for Christmas because, well, I don't know if you noticed, but I kind of look like a zombie, and that's mostly because I spend a lot of time on my computer in the middle of the night, which is not good for anybody's eyes. So I'm going to be wearing these from now on because it's good for my eyes and because it makes me look smarter. I just wanted to get ahead of all the comments wondering why I'm wearing glasses all of a sudden. Anyway, here's a really pretentious think piece on why Chancellor Neigh-Say is a very underrated antagonist.
Oh yeah, I'm
Trigger happy, yes I'm trigger happy. Better watch out, punk, or I'm gonna have to blow you away.
Hello everyone, and welcome to What Do I Know, the show where I know that nobody likes Chancellor Neigh-Say. Neigh-Say didn't really stand out as an antagonist during Season 8. I don't think anyone really expected him to, but it's still kind of disappointing when a villain fails to be all that interesting. Most fans just wrote him off as a racist whose only purpose was to provide an explanation for the lack of integration between the ponies and the other races of the show, and little else. I myself referred to him as little more than a xenophobic asshole and thought there wasn't much else to him. But that was before I took a world's politics class in college. Hey! Get your Trumps and Bernies out of my office! I'm not interested in anyone's political leanings here. I am here to talk about the philosophies and world politics and how they relate to Neigh-Say and his beliefs. Nothing else. While I am anticipating some political discussion in the comments section, I expect you all to behave yourselves. Whether the writers intended to include these themes in Season 8 is something I'll discuss in a minute, but regardless of the writers' intentions, the themes are there and I think they're worth discussing. By the end, I think you'll have a deeper appreciation for Neigh-Say and how his philosophy ties in with the themes explored in Season 8. Now, in order to understand anything I'm about to talk about, you first need to know a few of the basics of world politics. The one thing that every single country in the world has in common is that they are all after one thing: security. Or, to be more specific, security in three essential areas for any state to function: national security, the protection against internal and external threats; economic security, the assurance of an efficient and working economy; and human security, the assurance that the state's population and its rights will be respected and protected. The three major threats to security for any state are anarchy, diversity, and complexity. Anarchy comes from the lack of a central authority within the world, meaning that countries can basically do whatever they want, with no guarantee that when they do something wrong, they'll get punished for it. Diversity refers to the differences between these countries that lead them to conflict with one another. Complexity refers to the nuances of the various conflicts and controversies countries often find themselves embroiled in. Countries have a variety of ways in which they go about meeting these challenges, but the main way these challenges are addressed lies in how these countries interact with one another. And the ways they interact with one another generally fall under three different philosophies: realism, liberalism, and constructivism. Realism is a philosophy that is focused almost exclusively on self-help. It's a dog-eat-dog world, and you need to focus on number one. Liberalism is more about cooperating with other countries to mitigate the effects of anarchy and overcoming diversity through communication and reaching goals that are mutually beneficial. Constructivism argues that anarchy is constructed by the ideas and interactions within a society. The changes in the norms and values of the different states determine how the relationships between the states change over time. What does any of this have to do with Neigh-Say in Season 8? Well, I think Neigh-Say is a realist, and Season 8 is meant to be a critique of that philosophy while making a case for liberalism. Oh, and as a quick reminder, I'm only discussing liberalism in the context of world politics. The first and most obvious characteristic of realism that Neigh-Say reflects is how he views the nature of the international system of interaction. Realists believe that states only operate in terms of their own self-interest, and that other states have their own competing interests. The only sure way for countries to protect their interests and achieve their goals is to rely on themselves and nobody else.
You think this middleman is fun, but who built it? The Russians, the Chinese, Martians, Canadians? I don't care! All I know is we didn't build it, and that's reason enough to assume the worst and blow it to kingdom come!
There can be cooperation between countries, but such cooperation is the exception, not the rule. And even then, it's only done out of self-interest rather than some altruistic desire to help others. If a country with a powerful military promised to protect another country with plentiful resources, in exchange for said resources, they'd only be cooperating because it is in the best interest of both countries to do so. They both have something the other needs. It's basically the world's politics version of the idea that there's no such thing as a truly selfless act. Neigh-Say reflects this ideology in his apparent distaste for other races and his refusal to accredit Twilight School for allowing students other than ponies.
To defend ponies from dangerous creatures who don't have our best interests at heart.
As opposed to Twilight and Company's liberalism, which argues that cooperation between nations is the norm and should be encouraged in order to reach mutually beneficial goals.
If we want to keep our land safe and create a friendlier tomorrow, we need to teach the magic of friendship far and wide.
Neigh-Say's reasoning for refusing to accredit Twilight School highlights another aspect of realism, the belief that politics is a zero-sum game. One state must necessarily lose power for another to gain power, and the key to achieving national security is ensuring that your state has more power than all the rest. While liberalism argues that politics is a positive-sum game, i.e. a state does not necessarily have to lose for another to gain. There isn't a lot in Neigh-Say's dialogue that directly suggests that he believes world politics to be a zero-sum game, but it is implied in his worry that the other races may use what they learned at Twilight School to bring Equestria down.
And how do you know these creatures won't take what they have learned here and use it against us?
Everything we've seen from other countries in this show has shown us that Equestria is an objectively more prosperous country, and Twilight School of Friendship would provide other races with information that would help them to become more prosperous. Neigh-Say believes that the information that could be gleaned from Twilight School would reduce Equestria's power relative to the other countries, opening it up to more dangerous threats.
How to teach friendship to creatures who will one day use it as a weapon against us.
Now, when I say realists believe that their state must have more power than the rest, that usually translates into military power. Which makes sense, because the whole idea of realism is to make sure that you're the biggest bully on the playground. Indeed, many realists argue that military power is the most important form of power in international politics.
I'll waste you and a billion like you before I let any power rival America's.
The lack of competence seen in the Equestrian military may seem to throw a wrench in this reading of Neigh-Say's philosophy, but you have to remember that Neigh-Say isn't actually in control of the government, he's in charge of the school system. So the fact that Equestria's military leaves a lot to be desired is irrelevant. And anyway, it doesn't necessarily have to be military power. It just needs to be power that contributes to the nation's security in some way. In realism, human resources such as education and skill development are pursued because they ensure a more knowledgeable society that can defend itself, which is what initially piqued Neigh-Say's interest in Twilight School and Flim-and-Flam's University later in the season. He's only interested in the schools in the context of how they will help Equestria defend itself from outer threats.
A school for ponies to learn how to protect themselves.
Neigh-Say's refusal to accredit Twilight School also brings up another curious difference between realism and the other international relation philosophies, the lack of belief in international institutions and non-government organizations. If you don't know what a non-governmental organization is, it's basically any non-profit organization that operates separately from any government towards social or political purposes on a national or international level. Organizations like the Red Cross or the World Wildlife Fund come to mind. And, fun fact, you could argue terrorist organizations fit the description, though that's in no way saying that their actions should be condoned. Unlike liberalism or constructivism, realism argues that NGOs and international institutions have little to no mitigating effect on the threats to security. Twilight School could easily be considered a non-governmental organization given that it accepts creatures besides ponies. Such a setup would help build relations between the various races, given that they are all coming together to learn. And while an argument can be made that Twilight School is not an NGO, as it is literally run by royalty, it could very easily be considered an analogy for one. And given Neigh-Say's pessimism towards the idea of Twilight School helping build relations, it's not hard to see the parallels. Now, in many ways, this commentary is really smart, but I feel obligated to critique the show's seeming rejection of realism entirely. By having Neigh-Say reformed by the end of the season, the show seems to be arguing that realism as a philosophy has no redeeming qualities and it's best for everyone that it's never practiced or thought of ever again. And I don't think that that's a fair assessment. While there are many aspects of realism that I personally disagree with, there are aspects of realism that do have value, such as the importance of a nation's ability to defend itself and to have strong defendable borders. Because while it is important to have good relations with other countries, there will always be other groups or countries who intend to do you harm and cannot be negotiated with. You can't always rely on making peace with your enemies. We've seen this over the course of the show repeatedly. Chrysalis, Sombra, Tirek. The only reason Equestria isn't ruled by any of these would-be tyrants is because Twilight and her friends have long since learned how to weaponize friendship. It also makes the mistake of conflating realism with racism, which aren't strictly speaking the same thing. Realism is the belief that countries are only ever out for themselves, while racism is more the belief that certain races are inherently inferior or superior to others. While you can argue that realism and racism are uniquely compatible with one another, they're not always synonymous. A better example of a realist in this regard would be Lord Viren from The Dragon Prince, or the Governor from The Walking Dead. Viren's desire to unite the human realms to destroy the elves comes from a fear of the elves' supposedly imminent attack, but he doesn't bear any resentment towards them or think any less of them by nature of the race. If anything, he admires their strength, their courage, and their sense of honor. The fact that he's so determined to unite the other human kingdoms would seem to contradict the idea that he's a realist, but I'd argue that he only sees two nations, the Elves' Kingdom of Xadia and the Human Kingdoms, as implied by his referring to the other kingdoms' rulers as traitors when they refused to help Katalis fight the elves. And as for the Governor, well, his crew of survivors is pretty mixed, so racism clearly isn't an issue with him. Okay, so quick addendum to the original script here. You may have noticed that of the three realists that I've specifically named in this video, all of them have been antagonists, which doesn't really paint the philosophy in a very positive light. Realists aren't always looking for a fight or trying to destroy their enemies. It's more philosophy that's about self-preservation more than anything else. I don't know that this is some kind of push to paint realism in a negative light. I just think that realists tend to make really good villains, which is actually something that Neigh-Say has over the Governor and Viren. He's not actively trying to destroy other races, he's just trying to protect his country. Which brings us back to My Little Pony and talking about candy-colored cavalry. By conflating realism with racism, the show vilifies the philosophy without actually exploring its strengths and weaknesses. And it's more than a little hypocritical of MLP to demonize an ideology while preaching the values of respecting differences and communicating.
It is important to draw wisdom from many different places. If we take it from only one place, it becomes rigid and stale. Understanding others will help you become whole.
And you could argue that this commentary was not intentional on the writer's part. After all, this is a show aimed at little girls about emotions and social interactions, which is not the sort of show you typically focus on for sending a political message. But even if you could convince me that that makes it okay, I still wouldn't be so sure. If Neigh-Say and the school had been introduced 3 or 4 seasons prior, I would have been inclined to agree with the idea that this commentary was unintentional. But the thing is, as the show's gone on, the messages and ideas present within the show have become more and more mature. Do Princesses Dream of Magic Sheep was an episode about learning to appreciate the good you do in the world, and to not dwell on shortcomings long after such reflection would prove useful, something you wouldn't think the target demographic would need to learn at their age. Flutter Brudder was an episode about overcoming self-doubt and becoming self-sufficient. Again, not the most relatable dilemma for the target demographic. And Meltdown presented a scenario that won't become relatable for the target demographic for another 10 years or so. To be clear, I don't begrudge the show tackling more mature subjects. There's nothing wrong with that. If anything, I encourage it. But the more the messages seem to be aimed at a more mature audience as the show goes on, the more I doubt the idea that Season 8's critique of realism is unintentional, especially when you consider that this isn't even the first time My Little Pony has tackled realism versus liberalism. I got around to reading some of the Legends of Magic comics last summer, which contain individual stories focused on the pillars of Equestria. Of particular note is Legends of Magic number 3, which focuses on Mistmane helping the ponies who originally built Candlelock Castle with problems they were having around the construction site. The animals who lived in the area were attempting to prevent the castle's construction for fear that its completion would mean the ruination of their homes. The conflict was resolved when Mistmane encouraged Luna to take the time to listen to the animals, and with their help, Luna was able to redesign the castle to be more accommodating for the animals. Star Swirl was the one who originally designed the castle's plans, and he did so with the princess's security in mind. But, upon hearing Luna's story and seeing her new blueprints, he realizes that, and I quote, their safety would be determined more by how they ruled than where they lived. So, was Season 8's commentary unintentional? I honestly don't know. But I'm happy that the first few episodes of Season 9 have actually been addressing these issues quite nicely. The beginning of the end demonstrates the importance of an effective military by virtue of Sombra's sweep of both the Crystal Empire Guards and the Canterlot Guards. That, and Twilight 7 has shown that the ponies have finally learned their lesson and are looking to upgrade their security, even having Twilight and her friends attempt to infiltrate the castle to find any holes within the system. Theoretically, this push for better security would translate into a more effective military in the future as well, but that's hardly a guarantee, so what do I know? I'm Officer Trigger Happy, and f*** politics!
We're done here!